Jackman has had multiple basal cell carcinomas removed, a type of skin cancer caused by long-term UV exposure. These cancers often start off as small, easy-to-miss spots, but can slowly grow deeper into surrounding tissue if left untreated, in some cases eroding skin and underlying structures. His repeated diagnoses suggest damage that continues to surface years after the initial exposure. While rarely fatal, basal cell carcinoma can quietly develop, recur, and progressively invade tissue, making it more serious than most people realize. He's since used his experience to warn others about the dangers of UV exposure, regularly urging people to wear sunscreen and get their skin checked. In 2004 in South Africa, trophy hunter Ryan Naud, who ran Pro Hunt Africa and was known for killing endangered animals, was found dead beside his broken-down truck on a remote road. His vehicle had overheated, leaving him stranded and alone. When police arrived, he was lying next to the truck with multiple gunshot wounds, suggesting he had been approached at close range and executed. There were no clear signs of a struggle, and his belongings were left behind, making the motive unclear. Many speculate the killing was retaliatory due to his work killing protected wildlife, but no suspects were ever identified, and the case remains unsolved. On Christmas Eve in 2008, 45-year-old Bruce Jeffrey Pardo arrived at his ex-wife's house in California wearing a Santa Claus suit and carrying multiple firearms. When the front door was opened by an 8-year-old girl, he shot her in the face before opening fire at a crowded family Christmas party. Bruce then unleashed a homemade fuel dispensing device hidden inside a wrapped present, igniting a massive fire that trapped victims inside as the house burned. 9 people were killed, some by gunfire, and others burned so badly that it took investigators several days to identify them. The fire burned so intensely that parts of Bruce's Santa suit melted onto his skin, forcing him to flee while still on fire. He later drove to his brother's house, where he turned the gun on himself. Investigators later determined the attack was driven by rage over a recent divorce, mounting financial pressure after losing his job, and a bitter custody dispute, with Bruce specifically targeting his ex-wife and her family. Police discovered that he'd spent months preparing, stockpiling weapons, booby-trapping vehicles with explosives, and compiling a list of additional targets, including his ex-wife's divorce attorney, making the attack one of the most disturbing holiday massacres in U.S. history. 2. During World War II, Nazi SS units carried out one of the regime's most disturbing programs, the mass kidnapping of up to 200,000 Polish children for forced Germanization. After being taken from their families, the children were sent to SS-run children's education camps, where they were subjected to horrific racial selection exams. SS doctors measured their skulls, noses, eye colors, and body proportions, trying to determine whether each child looked Aryan enough to be turned into a German. If a child passed the test, they were renamed, stripped of their identity, and adopted into German families as if they'd never been Polish at all. But if they failed, their fate was much darker. Many were transported to concentration camps, where countless children died from starvation, disease, abuse, or execution. Only an estimated 10 to 15% of the kidnapped children were ever found and returned to Poland after the war. At the Nuremberg trials, the Allies confirmed the program a form of genocide, the deliberate attempt to erase an entire population by stealing and remaking their children. Kim Kardashian's 2018 Met Gala photo, taken in front of the gilded coffin of Nedja Monk, caught the attention of the Manhattan DA's Antiquities Trafficking Unit. When investigators looked into the artifact's paperwork, they discovered the export documents were forged and the coffin had actually been looted from Egypt in 2011. The viral photo helped trigger the investigation that ultimately exposed the trafficking network and led to the coffin being returned to Egypt in 2019. When Yoshitaro Shibasaki and his team scaled Mount Sarugi in 1907, believed at the time to be Japan's final unclimbed peak, they were stunned to find ancient relics already waiting at the summit. A decorative metal staff fitting and a sword were discovered near the top, and later analysis revealed they'd been placed there over 1,000 years earlier. This 250-year-old mechanical swan still glides and bends its neck as if it were still alive. Built in 1773 by master showman James Cox and ingenious inventor John Joseph Merlin, the automaton uses hundreds of hidden clockwork components to make the bird preen, ripple the water below it, and even snatch a silver fish from the stream. In 1835, a man digging a duck pond in Margate, England, accidentally discovered the Shell Grotto, an underground chalk passage decorated with about 4.6 million seashells arranged across 2,000 square feet of mosaic. Most of the shells, mussels, oysters, scallops, etc., appear to have been collected from nearby Kent beaches, though some are foreign species. Its age, purpose, and creators remain completely unknown. In 2001, U.S. border agents at the Mexican border discovered 42-year-old Enrique Aguilar Canchola sitting inside a hollowed-out passenger seat that had been modified to look completely normal. He'd been sewn into the seat to sneak into the U.S. undetected, but agents noticed the seat looked unusually bulky and pulled the car aside. Canchola was immediately arrested along with the driver. In 1980, the FBI set up a fake company to expose corrupt politicians, and 25% of the congressmen who were offered bribes accepted them, leading to multiple convictions in one of the largest stings in U.S. history. In 2025, South Carolina teaching assistant Alexander Lewis was arrested after repeatedly spraying a powerful fart spray inside of West Florence High School, triggering nausea, headaches, and respiratory issues among students and staff. The odor contaminated parts of the building's ventilation system, forcing inspections and cleanup that totaled more than $55,000 in damage. Lewis was charged with disturbing schools and malicious injury to property, turning what he thought was a harmless prank into one of the most expensive school incidents of the year. In one of the most disturbing cases ever shown on My Strange Addiction, a Tennessee woman named Casey developed a heartbreaking obsession after her husband Sean died suddenly from an asthma attack. Stricken with grief, she began carrying his urn everywhere, talking to it, sleeping beside it, and treating it like her husband was still alive. One day, when some of the ashes accidentally spilled on her hand, she instinctively licked them off, and soon enough became addicted to doing it deliberately. She admitted to eating the ashes up to 5 times per day, worried that if she ever stopped, she'd truly lose him forever. The ashes reportedly tasted like sand and rotten eggs, but she couldn't resist the rare feeling of closeness it gave her. Over time, she eventually consumed nearly a pound of her husband's remains, until appearing on the show finally made her realize how far her grief had gone. After filming, Casey entered therapy and eventually stopped consuming the ashes, keeping his urn nearby as a reminder of love rather than loss. NHL star Johnny Gaudreau, known as Johnny Hockey, built a reputation as one of the league's most electric, undersized scorers, dazzling fans with elite speed despite standing just 5'9". But in August of 2024, he returned to his New Jersey hometown with his younger brother Matthew for their sister's wedding weekend, a trip meant to be a celebration. While riding bicycles together along a rural road at night, police say a drunk driver attempted to pass traffic and slammed into both brothers from behind, killing them at the young ages of 31 and 29. Prosecutors later charged the driver with aggravated manslaughter, reckless vehicular homicide, evidence tampering, and leaving the scene, with the case still moving through courts as the hockey world mourned one of its brightest stars. But just today, after Team USA defeated Canada in overtime to secure Olympic gold, players carried Gaudreau's number 13 jersey onto the ice and brought his children into the celebration, dedicating the victory to him in an emotional tribute that showed how deeply his loss still resonates across the sport. This was the moment an airport security worker in the Philippines swallowed $300 in cash to avoid being arrested. The money had allegedly been taken from a passenger's bag during a routine screening, and when the traveler reported it missing, airport staff confronted the employee as cameras were rolling. Her bizarre attempt to hide the evidence quickly went viral online, prompting officials to suspend her from duty while an investigation moved forward. Here's the before and after of an imperial crown left mangled following the 2025 Louvre heist, where thieves forced it through a narrow slit cut into its reinforced display case, crushing the delicate gold frame as they pulled it free. During the escape, the damaged crown was dropped just outside of the museum and quickly recovered by authorities, though it had been badly deformed from being forced out and striking the ground. The Louvre has since formed a restoration committee and begun seeking proposals to fix it, with early estimates starting around $50,000, though officials say the real cost will come from the painstaking hours of delicate repair needed to rebuild the 170-year-old piece. In March of 2019, rising Liverpool indie duo Hers were in the middle of their first US tour when tragedy struck. After performing a packed show in Phoenix, 24-year-old Stephen Fitzpatrick and 25-year-old Alden Lauding began their overnight drive to California with their tour manager. Just before 1 a.m., their van was hit head-on by a pickup truck driving the wrong way on Interstate 10. The collision erupted into flames, killing all 4 men instantly. Investigators reported no signs of braking and found an open container in the wrong-way driver's wreckage, suggesting alcohol may have been involved. Just hours earlier, the band had posted that their US tour was going swimmingly and that they were almost home. Their debut album, Invitation to Hers, would become their final record. In 2012, a Pennsylvania tree worker named James Valentine was trimming branches high off the ground when his chainsaw suddenly kicked back. In an instant, the blade plunged deep into his neck and shoulder, stopping just millimeters short of severing vital arteries. Miraculously, the chain jammed before it could spin further, but the saw itself remained embedded in his flesh. First responders found him conscious with the chainsaw still lodged in place and carefully stabilized it as he was airlifted to a trauma center. After hours of delicate surgery, doctors successfully removed the saw and repaired the massive tissue damage. Against all odds, Valentine made a full recovery. Before fame, Shania Twain was already carrying adult burdens as a child, singing in bars until 1 a.m. at the age of 8 just to help keep her family afloat. But in 1987, that fragile stability was suddenly destroyed when her mother and stepfather were killed in a violent car accident after their vehicle was struck head-on by a truck driven by a drunk driver. Shania was only 22 when she became the legal guardian of her 4 younger siblings, putting her music career on hold to raise them and keep the family together, stepping into survival mode years before the world ever knew her name. Christopher Tapp spent more than 20 years in prison for the 1996 murder of 18-year-old Angie Dodge, a crime he didn't commit. Police had coerced a false confession out of him, even though none of the DNA at the scene matched. In 2019, genetic genealogy finally identified the real killer, leading to Tapp's full exoneration and a record-breaking $11.7 million settlement he received in 2022. But less than a year after finally reclaiming his life, Tapp was found beaten and unresponsive in a Las Vegas hotel room after an altercation. The coroner ruled his death a homicide, and a former pro wrestler was later charged.
So I'm being treated like a murderer? No. I just love my face.
No. I know that. And I know this isn't easy for you. That's...
In July of 2024, 34-year-old Arizona father Christopher Schultz left his 2-year-old daughter strapped in her car seat for nearly 3 hours in blistering 109-degree heat while he stayed inside playing video games, drinking beer, and watching porn. He claimed he'd left the air conditioning on in the car, but investigators discovered the car's engine automatically shut off after 30 minutes, cutting the AC long before the child's death. When his wife came home, she found their daughter unresponsive and covered in sweat. It wasn't the first time either. His 2 older daughters later told investigators that he had left them in the car many times before, sometimes for long stretches. His wife had even texted him warnings, writing, "I told you to stop leaving them in the car. How many times have I told you?" That day, after realizing what had happened, Schultz frantically texted her, writing, "Babe, I'm sorry. How could I do this? I killed our baby. This can't be real." She responded in devastation, saying, "We've lost her. She was perfect." Digital evidence revealed that during those same hours, he'd been browsing porn sites and gaming as his daughter slowly roasted outside, what prosecutors later called a grotesque display of neglect and self-absorption. Schultz was charged with first-degree murder and child abuse, though he ultimately accepted a plea to second-degree murder with a 20 to 30-year sentence. Then, in a final twist, he recently took hours before being booked into prison for his sentence. On November 13, 1982, Duck Koo Kim fought Ray Mancini for the WBA lightweight title in Las Vegas. In the 14th round, Kim was knocked down hard and the fight was stopped. Minutes later, he collapsed from a massive brain hemorrhage, fell into a coma, and died 4 days later at age 27. Then, just a couple months later, in early 1983, Kim's mother died after traveling to the U.S. and struggling with her son's death. Just a few months after that, referee Richard Green also took after reportedly falling into severe depression, overwhelmed by guilt and public blame for not stopping the fight sooner. The bout became one of the darkest moments in boxing history and directly led to major safety reforms in the elimination of 15-round title fights. In 1977, unemployed Indiana man Tony Karitzis kidnapped mortgage banker Richard Hall after blaming him for the foreclosure of his home. Tony strapped a sawed-off shotgun to Richard's neck, rigged with a dead man trigger so any sudden movement could fire it, and held him hostage inside the Meridian Mortgage Company for nearly 3 days. During the standoff, Richard was forced to walk outside in public and even stand through a live press conference with the gun still pressed against his neck. With negotiations failing and Richard's life constantly at risk, police ended the siege by shooting Tony through a window, killing him instantly as Richard survived unharmed. In 2018, Richard Bebo Russell, a 28-year-old Horizon Air ground agent, stunned the aviation world when he quietly climbed into a Bombardier Q400 at Seattle-Tacoma Airport, started the engines from knowledge he'd picked up from YouTube and flight simulators, and took off without a license or clearance. For nearly an hour, he flew over Puget Sound chatting calmly with air traffic control, admitting he was a broken guy while performing a full barrel roll in a 76-seat passenger plane. F-15 fighter jets scrambled to intercept him, but he refused to land, steering the aircraft away from cities before deliberately crashing it into the woods of Ketron Island. The explosion killed only him, scorched acres of forest, and exposed a massive security gap at the airport. In 2014, 43-year-old Chad Olson was reportedly texting his babysitter during movie previews when the man behind him, 71-year-old retired police captain Curtis Reeves, told him to put the phone away. The argument escalated. Olson tossed a handful of popcorn in frustration, and Reeves instantly responded by pulling a handgun and shooting him in the chest. Olson died later that day, while his wife was also injured while trying to block the shot with her hand. Despite witnesses saying Olson never got physical beyond the popcorn, a jury ultimately acquitted Reeves in 2022, accepting his claim that he fired in self-defense under Florida's Stand Your Ground law. A 5-year-old kindergartner in Standish, Maine was recently killed after his arm became trapped in the closing doors of his school bus as it pulled away from his morning stop, leaving him pinned to the vehicle and dragged nearly 300 feet along the pavement. Investigators determined the driver was unaware the child was caught and continued driving until other motorists began frantically signaling that something was wrong. The child eventually lost his grip, fell into the roadway, and was run over by the same bus, suffering catastrophic injuries and dying at the scene. The bus driver, a 64-year-old woman, was placed on administrative leave and no charges were filed. The tragic death was ruled accidental, but the case triggered an investigation by the National Transportation Safety Board after it was confirmed the bus's door systems failed to detect the child before the vehicle moved, raising concerns about blind spots, sensor limitations, and school bus loading zone safety. Christopher John Sulos was a kind 37-year-old man with intellectual disabilities including autism who worked as a beloved greeter at a Chick-fil-A in Charlotte, North Carolina. But one day in September of 2024, a customer said there was an emergency and asked to borrow his phone. Instead, they stole it from him and used it to try transferring money from his account. They then began sending harassing messages to him and his family, falsely accusing him of being a pervert and other serious sexual misconduct. The perpetrators soon threatened to spread these accusations to his employer and the public unless a ransom was paid. The relentless harassment and fear of public humiliation caused Sulos severe emotional distress. Believing he had genuinely done something wrong, he tragically took just a few days later. His family and federal investigators linked the cyberstalking, extortion, and false accusations directly to his death. The people responsible were later convicted and sentenced to 27 and 41 months in prison. This was the moment when officers found Marvin Morales lying unresponsive on the floor of a station bathroom. A California sheriff's deputy who just overdosed on cocaine he'd stolen from people he arrested, which later tested positive for fentanyl. Deputies had to rush in and administer Narcan to revive him, and he was fired soon afterward. But on December 2nd, 2025, Morales resurfaced in the most horrific way imaginable. That morning, he stabbed his 11-year-old son multiple times inside their own home, while the boy's 6-year-old sister hid nearby, too terrified to move. Deputies who arrived described blood pooled near the entryway, and signs the boy had tried to crawl toward the front door. Morales fled before anyone could reach him, leading to a pursuit down Interstate 5 that ended when spike strips shredded his tires. As the car crashed to a stop, he reportedly drew a weapon, forcing officers who had worked with him in the past to shoot him. Morales died hours later at the hospital, while the sheriff called the crime one of the most devastating his department had ever encountered. E.J. Carey, a former Irish hurling legend, was jailed after admitting he spent years faking a cancer diagnosis to scam friends and contacts out of nearly £350,000. Prosecutors revealed he sent staged photos showing what appeared to be medical tubing in his nose, later exposed as an iPhone charging cable taped to his face. He claimed the money was urgently needed for treatment, exploiting sympathy and trust while continuing the deception. The scheme collapsed when victims grew suspicious, and authorities confirmed he never even had cancer at all. Carey pleaded guilty to multiple fraud charges and was sentenced to more than 5 years in prison. A man once spent nearly 5 months locked inside Rikers Island without realizing he could have walked free at any point for just $2. Court records later showed a judge had ordered his release only a week after he was arrested for a nonviolent offense, setting an absurdly low bail, but his lawyer never told him. With no one informing him of his status, he remained trapped inside one of the most notoriously violent jail complexes in the United States, a place long plagued by assaults, gang activity, neglect, and inmate murders. By the time the mistake had been discovered, months of his life had already been lost to one of the most dangerous detention systems in the country. Florida high school principal Dr. George Kenney built a devoted following by hypnotizing students to boost confidence and performance despite not being licensed. But in 2011, 3 teens he had worked with died within months of each other, 1 in a car crash and 2 by suicide, raising alarm from families who believed the hypnosis may have caused psychological harm. Investigators never proved a direct link to the deaths, but Kenney was charged with practicing hypnosis without a license, pleaded no contest, and resigned in 2012. Lawsuits from the victims' families ended in settlements, while Kenney quietly left Florida and withdrew from public life, leaving the controversy unresolved. John C. Woods, the U.S. Army hangman who carried out the executions of Nazis at the Nuremberg trials, completely lied about his qualifications to get the job, claiming prior experience as an executioner when none of it could later be verified. As a result of his incompetence, several condemned Nazi officials did not die from a clean neck break, which is the intended outcome of a properly calculated drop. Instead, multiple prisoners slowly strangled in agony, some taking up to 20 minutes to die while witnesses observed visible suffering. Despite complaints from observers, Woods continued performing executions and was never formally disciplined for the botched hangings. Steven Stucker, best known for playing the chaotic air controller in Airplane, died in 1986 at just 38 years old due to complications with AIDS. At the time, the disease was still poorly understood, widely feared, and heavily stigmatized, especially within the entertainment industry. He publicly revealed his diagnosis in 1985, making him one of the first recognizable entertainers to speak openly about having AIDS during a period when many kept it hidden out of fear of backlash and discrimination. Like many early AIDS patients, his condition quickly deteriorated before any effective treatments existed. His death came at a time when thousands were dying under similar circumstances, helping to bring more visibility to a crisis that had long been ignored. In 1978, in Birmingham, England, medical photographer Janet Parker became the last person to die from smallpox after being exposed at the University of Birmingham Medical School, likely through airborne transmission from a laboratory working with the virus just 1 floor below her office. She developed symptoms days later and died on September 11th after several weeks in isolation. The outbreak triggered a massive public health response, including quarantines and emergency vaccines, but no further cases spread beyond Janet. During the crisis, her father suffered a fatal heart attack while visiting her in the hospital. In Gainesville, Georgia, a group of high school students decided to prank their math teacher by toilet papering his yard late at night. When 40-year-old teacher and golf coach Jason Hughes ran outside, he was reportedly joking around and pretending to catch them in the act as they ran back to their car. But as the teens tried to speed away, Hughes slipped on the wet pavement and fell into the road. One of the students, an 18-year-old driving a pickup truck, accidentally ran him over. Hughes was rushed to the hospital but tragically died from his injuries. The driver was initially charged with first-degree vehicular homicide, while several other students were arrested for trespassing and littering. But Hughes's family later asked prosecutors to drop the charges, saying the beloved teacher cared deeply about his students and never would have wanted any of their lives destroyed over a prank. Between 2014 and 2015, Ohio woman Brittany Pilkington was responsible for the deaths of 3 of her children, all infant sons, over a 13-month span. The first child's death was initially ruled a case of SIDS, but suspicions grew after a second infant died under similar circumstances. Doctors briefly considered a possible genetic condition, and despite investigations, the youngest boy was returned home only to also die a few days later. One of her children, the only daughter, was never harmed. In police questioning, Brittany confessed to deliberately smothering all 3. She described restraining the older one by holding his legs during the struggle until he went limp after a few minutes. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a long history of trauma surrounding the family. Brittany was repeatedly beaten by her biological father as a child, and even worse, her husband was her former stepfather, whom she said had groomed and sexually abused her starting after she eventually married him as a teenager. In 2018, she pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In December of 2025, a judge in Arkansas awarded joint custody of 6-year-old twins Eliana and Maverick Bialis to their father, Dr. Randy Bialis, after a full-day divorce hearing. Their mother, 40-year-old Charity Bialis, had represented herself in court and failed to convince the judge that Randy was abusive, despite the fact that earlier that year he admitted to strangling her in front of the children and pleaded guilty to third-degree battery, receiving a suspended sentence. Less than 24 hours after the custody ruling, Deputies entered Charity's home after concerns were raised about the family. Inside, they found Charity and both twins dead to gunshot wounds. Investigators determined the home alarm had been deactivated from Charity's phone around 10 p.m. There were no signs of forced entry, and Randy's phone and vehicle records showed he was nowhere near the house. Authorities ultimately concluded that Charity shot Eliana and Maverick before turning the gun on just days before she was scheduled to hand the children over to her ex-husband. This is one of the rarest sights a hiker can ever witness, the broken specter, where your shadow doesn't fall on the ground but appears to float like a giant ghost in the clouds behind you. When the sun hits a bank of mist at the perfect angle, your silhouette gets projected onto the fog and wrapped in a circular rainbow called a glory, creating the illusion of a towering figure surrounded by a halo. For centuries, mountaineers thought this was a supernatural omen since conditions have to line up perfectly for it to happen. Dense fog in front of you, clear sun behind you, and just seconds before the mist shifts and the whole apparition vanishes. Here's one of the rarest friendships ever recorded on camera. A Siberian tiger calmly strolling alongside a goat that was literally thrown inside its enclosure to be eaten. Everyone expected a routine kill like usual, but instead the tiger backed off, the goat stood his ground, and the two formed a bond no one could explain. They wandered the enclosure together like companions, stunning zookeepers as a predator and its intended meal lived in total harmony. After their unlikely bond went viral, the zoo kept them together under close supervision, naming them Timur and Amr. They stayed inseparable for months, sleeping near each other, exploring the enclosure, and even play fighting. But soon enough, instincts kicked in and the two became aggressive toward each other, ending one of the strangest animal friendships ever recorded. That was the moment a grieving father threw a chair at a judge inside a Dutch courtroom after hearing the sentence for the man responsible for killing his family members. In 2013, a speeding driver lost control of his car in Mayol, Netherlands, striking and killing a 2-year-old girl and her grandparents as they rode bicycles. The driver was initially sentenced to just 120 hours of community service and a 1-year suspended license, a ruling that sparked outrage in the courtroom. Prosecutors later appealed, and the sentence was increased to 15 months in prison and a 4-year driving ban. Elderly Englishman Stan Beaton kept a voicemail greeting recorded years earlier that included the voice of his wife Ruby, who died of cancer in 2003. For more than a decade, he would play the message almost every day just to hear her voice again. When a telecommunications system upgrade accidentally deleted the recording, engineers at the phone company spent several days searching archive servers until they were finally able to recover it. When the message was played for him again during a BBC interview, Beaton broke down in tears after hearing his wife's voice for the first time since it was lost. Real estate agent Todd Kohlhepp became known as the Amazon Review Killer after investigators uncovered sarcastic product reviews he had posted that referenced his real crimes. For years, he joked about using knives, chains, and shovels while remaining unidentified. In 2016, police traced the disappearance of Kayla Brown to his rural South Carolina property, where she was found alive, chained inside a shipping container after Kohlhepp had already murdered her boyfriend. A search of the land revealed multiple buried bodies, and Kohlhepp later confessed to killing 7 people between 2003 and 2016, including 4 victims in a long cold motorcycle shop massacre. Kim Stanger is a criminal law researcher in Ohio who lives with an extremely rare neurological condition that leaves her with no sense of touch, pain, or temperature. Her peripheral nerves don't transmit any sensory signals, meaning she cannot feel injuries, burns, or pressure on her body. Doctors have described her as the only living person documented with a complete loss of somatosensation at this level. As a result, Stanger must visually monitor her body at all times to avoid unknowingly injuring herself, as even severe wounds or extreme temperatures provide no physical warning. This woman convinced herself she needed human blood to survive the way other people need food. Starting in 1989, Brisbane's Tracy Wigington started killing animals, storing their bodies, and drinking their blood in private feedings before deciding she needed a living human victim. With 3 friends, she lured 47-year-old Edward Baldock into her car and drove him to a riverbank. The moment he stepped out, Wigington ambushed him with a hunting knife so violently that investigators said the wounds were frenzied and his throat was sliced so deep his head was nearly severed. She crouched over him as he died and drank from the blood pouring from the gash in his neck. Detectives later said the scene was so saturated with blood it looked ritualistic, and photos recovered from Wigington showed she'd been staging mock sacrifices with her friends in the months leading up to the murder. When police searched her belongings, they also found jars of preserved animal remains and notebooks describing her goal of becoming a fully transformed vampire. She pleaded guilty and received life in prison, yet still walked free in 2012, leaving one of Australia's most senseless and sadistic murders behind her.